When teachers train you in descriptive writing, they go large on imagery. But this video is about the secret sauce of descriptive writing, contrast. You're going to get top grade training right now. The easiest way to develop contrast in your writing is to use the word but. You describe something first and then follow it on with a but and a further description. Here I'll show you. A dozen cows grazed in the field. Now with the addition of the word but, I'm going to introduce a contrast to the verb grazed. The earth was parched and the few ragged tufts of green didn't satisfy them. So although the cows were grazing, they weren't feeling full. Suddenly I have a really developed description just because I've used a contrast with the word but. In this second example, you'll see how the contrast is built around a near opposite. Sunshine blazed upon the beach, but the freezing sea left the bathers gasping for air. Again, all that detail comes from the but and then thinking of a near opposite to contrast it to. In this example, I'm going to show it to you combined with personification. Autumn painted the hills with browns, russets and golds, so the autumn is being personified as a painter, but winter washed the scene with grey skies and snowy fields. Washed is the verb for painters colouring a background in a particular shade. Contrasting using the seasons is a really easy trick for your description as well. The girl sat listening to her friend's plans, but she didn't dare tell him they were bound to fail. Again, you can see how the verbs are contrasted by being near opposites, just as they were with blazed and freezing. Let's now combine these two ideas of the but contrast and the contrast of opposites. So we could have a description by day and then contrast that with a but for nighttime, a near opposite. And this is super easy for you to do in any descriptive question in the exam. By day, the streets were full of colour and life, from the fruit stalls to the clothing mannequins, from the idle shoppers traipsing with their whining children to the buskers strumming clumsily at the guitar. Notice as well how useful the list sentence is for layering description and creating a vivid picture. By night we're still with the streets, but instead of being full of colour, they're now emptied, because the soul of the town had been stripped out of it, whereas all this description was about how it was full. Stripped out of it by glass-fronted stores, fast food outlets and coffee shops. Now the contrast, which was full of people and children, is going to change. No one lived here except the homeless on their cardboard mattresses in abandoned doorways. And my daytime description finished with buskers and the guitar. Now the contrast is abandoned doorways, silence. Now this has the effect of making your description dynamic with a lot of movement to it. Of course, you can't really put a lot of events in your description because it will turn into a story, but using contrast you're able to introduce time in this way to look at descriptions as though they were different events, but of course they're not part of a narrative. They're not a story, so you won't get marked down for suddenly veering into story writing. Another really useful way of introducing contrast is to base it around a character's age. So here imagine an old man. He felt his hip twinge, which on its own was bearable, but as his knees were already filled with gravel and his knuckles filled with crushed glass, he looked for a park bench to rest at. At last, uncomfortably damp with sweat, even in this bitter cold, he sat and propped his stick at his side. So our first contrast is how he's feeling, damp with sweat, and then the contrast with the bitter cold of the weather. Now, another contrast. As the pain eased, he opened his eyes. So this contrasts with the pain he felt when he was moving. Now we have the contrast of age. So young mothers. Young mothers strolled across the park. Notice the verb strolled contrasts with the twinge as he was walking. Some of them striding even in heels. Notice how that contrasts with the pain in his own knees. While their children shot off left and right, so now we have a contrast of age with children moving at speed compared to him who has had to stop with his walking stick and sit on the bench, only to return like boomerangs, screaming with happiness and youth. And so now there is another contrast. Because the children are happy, we infer that the old man might not be. Then in the third paragraph, it's really easy to go into another contrast about age, his memories when he was young. Memories of his young summers came back to him. Notice the season is also a contrast. This feels like winter because of the cold, but he's remembering summer. And one morning, lying in the barley field, with his eyes half shut in the sunshine. Again the contrast of sun with the cold. When, through the swaying stalks, her red dress flashed to him like a beacon, and Susan entered his life. She changed it forever. Now we have a contrast of Susan, this person who he must have fallen in love with the young mothers that someone else has fallen in love with. And also Susan, the love of his life, who we infer is no longer there. He feels alone. So using contrast in this way has allowed us a real insight into this character. We've created a sense of drama even though nothing has happened. All he's done is sat down on his park bench and looked at what's around him. So contrast allows you to invite a narrative into your description without turning it into a story. It's genius, isn't it? All the examples in this video have come from my ultimate guide to descriptive writing. Links in the didgeridoo below. And if you want to develop your contrast further, let's look at contrast with character and setting. Now that's so useful because whatever the exam question is, you will be able to introduce a character into it. Let me show you. Gumbrel lived in a tall, narrow-shouldered, rickety house in a little obscure square not far from Paddington. There were 5 floors and a basement with beetles. So now we have a contrast of Gumbrel with his house. It makes us wonder whether he too is rickety, whether his own basement metaphorically is full of beetles. It's an image of decay, isn't it? So the house now stands in for Gumbrel himself. It had nearly 100 stairs, which shook when someone ran on them. So this invites us to think that maybe Gumbrel is getting on for nearly 100 years old. And if his body is also fragile like the shaking house. Gumbrel's running days were gone though. The house was prematurely old and decaying in a part of town which was declining rapidly. So again, we're invited to wonder whether Gumbrel is also declining rapidly, whether he too is decaying. The houses, which a few years ago had all been occupied by respectable families, were now split up into squalid little apartments. Now his house contrasts with the other houses in the road. He's still managing to keep the whole house for himself. He's a throwback to the past. But that means he is also respectable, unlike the squalid area he's living in. And from the neighbouring slums, invading bands of children battled on the once sacred pavements. So now we have the contrast of age. Outside is quite violent and loud, but full of children. Inside is the old man Gumbrel himself. Mr. Gumbrel was almost the last survivor of the old inhabitants because he loved his garden and the 14 elm trees which welcomed the starlings who came every evening in summertime to roost in their branches. So now the contrast to the outside is developed. He is one of the last of the old inhabitants, the last survivor, and that is contrasted with the many trees, the 14 of them, and the many starlings. So we're going to get a contrast of the single, lone and alone Gumbrel to his surroundings. He used to sit out on his balcony waiting for the coming of the birds. And just at sunset, when the sky was most golden, there would be a twittering overhead and the black innumerable flocks of starlings would come sweeping across the sky to roost in the trees. So his stillness is now contrasted with their movement, his waiting for their fast coming. The sky is golden, symbolic of how he feels about this moment. and that's contrasted with the black bodies and shape of the flock of starlings. The description continues, there were plenty of larger and leafier gardens all around, another contrast to Gumbrel's garden, but they remained birdless, again a contrast, while every evening a faithful legion of starlings settled clamorously among his trees. A legion is a battalion of Roman soldiers, again contrasting the huge number of the starlings to Gumbrel being alone. They sat and chattered till the sun went down and twilight was over. The birds chattering almost personifies them. It makes them sound like his friends, which again is a contrast to what we would expect. We would expect him to have living human friends, but obviously they've either died or moved away. Silence fell suddenly and inexplicably on all the birds at once, lasted a few seconds of thrilling suspense before erupting in an outburst of the same loud and simultaneous conversation. Again, that's the birds making this loud conversation, another contrast to our expectations, and a contrast to the silence which had fallen. Now the silence takes on a kind of symbolic meaning, suggesting the end of Mr. Gumbrel's day, but also the end of his days, of his life. Now that we've had these verbs of the starlings chattering and talking, the description clearly personifies them. The starlings were Mr. Gumbrel's most cherished friends. Sitting out on his balcony to watch and listen to them, he had caught many colds and chills. So this again is a contrast with our expectations. The description had started in summertime, remember, but now we're moving towards winter, because obviously Gumbrel is out even in the cold, and it brings the idea of his imminent death closer. And that's all done through contrast. Yet he was always visible in the twilight, sitting on the balcony, gazing up, round, spectacled and rapt at the 14 elm trees. While the birds chattered, he sat silently. Contrast again. His bony hand would clutch at his thin grey beard, stroking until darkness came and the starlings rejoined their flocks. So again we get the image of decay. He's getting weak, getting bony, whereas the starlings are capable of flight and escape. So nothing has happened in the sense that we don't have a story, but we feel as though we've been on a journey with Mr. Gumbrel, not just on a typical evening, but his journey towards eventual death. And it's done in a way which isn't depressing because of his companions, the youthful and vibrant starlings. It's as though they're celebrating his life. We feel a sense of pity for Gumbrel, but not a sense of tragedy. All the text in this video has come from my ultimate guide to descriptive writing, links in the description below. Now, if you want to take your description to the next level, you probably want to watch this video on using similes like a boss. See you over there.